Thanks everyone for being here. First, I just want to start by thanking my amazing colleagues at CDDRL and the ones who are here today, all of you for taking the time to come on a beautiful day. But this book was a labor of labor rather than a labor of love. It really took a village. So Catherine Stoner, as the director of CDDRL, was really a wonderful mentor through so much of this project. We shared an editor and a publisher at Oxford. You were instrumental to this book's completion when I was associate director. Our events team of Amy, Nora, and Kristen Chandler, who's not here because it's ski week, are always putting together the most amazing events and have done so for years, and I really appreciate it. And finally, our panelists, Jake, Julia, and Bruce, have been unwitting interlocutors through a lot of this book's ideas, and I've learned so much from their work, and I really appreciate the more general intellectual community that is concerned about the state of democracy. What I'm really thinking about for this event today is to be a sort of conversation about the state of political parties, because political events are quickly eclipsing our ability to understand them. So yeah, let's just go ahead and start. So I thought about starting in a gimmicky way. In the 2024 election, we had a Republican and a Democratic candidate. And in improv style, I was going to ask you to yell out some adjectives that you associate with the Republican and Democratic parties. But I figured they would all be negative. So let's just skip ahead because the press does it too. The Republican Party these days is seen as having experienced a hostile takeover by President Trump, at least since 2016. The party at the sort of center right has been sidelined, and now the party is a personalist vehicle for, I think, his undoubtedly authoritarian ambitions. Whereas the Democratic Party has experienced a lot of blame and finger pointing about how they botched a nominations process and an election in which kind of bread and butter issues that they historically do pretty well on were central to the campaign. So we have two parties in disarray, and this is the state of our parties today. They seem weak, they seem completely disconnected from the societies they serve. They're accused of being only power hungry, and this anti-party sentiment, which has been present since the nation's founding, is widespread and also growing. If we look just at the United States, despite the fact that we live in an era of polarization, although I'd say our problems now are beyond that, the trend in partisan identification is that fewer and fewer people identify as Republicans and Democrats, and most identify as independents, a plurality of Americans these days. More and more Americans also say that they are cynical about both parties and trust neither one of them. There's a lot of evidence showing that this rising sense of independence in the electorate is correlated with cynicism about the state of political parties and the way the system works overall, with a lot of cynicism about, in particular, the way political and economic interests become fused in policymaking. There's also anti-party sentiment around the world. This is evidence from the book in 21 advanced democracies that have party competition between a center-right and a center-left set of mainstream parties. The vote share for those parties has been in decline for decades, while the vote share for challenger parties or new parties has been on the rise. And in public attitude surveys about how you feel about national institutions like security sector institutions, the courts, the legislatures, parties consistently rank at the bottom in global attitudes. This anti-party sentiment is pretty widespread, and it influences a lot of the ways we think about democracy. So I have a lot of conversations with people in the reform community who are interested in institutional innovations to improve American democracy, for example. And they have very good intentions, but when they don't like parties, their reform ideas tend to reflect that. So there's a sense that we might be able to wish away political parties in our political system. Some organizations say if you just put country first and take the party out of this mess of politics, you can get individual candidates that transcend party labels. Alternatively, the Forward Party is one of many attempts to establish a third party, especially in presidential elections. And again, there's always kind of this idea that if we just have a middle ground or a set of good issues that come to the fore, we don't need parties, which just inculcate loyalties that seem tribal. But at the same time, this sense that we don't need parties has led to solutions like the top 4 or top 5 primary and ranked choice voting, which would mean party labels are less relevant to the selection of candidates. And a lot of the initiatives that had a lot of philanthropic funding and some level of activism, but really they were very technocratic ideas, have failed to win popular support. These are the ballot initiatives in the 2024 election that tried to do that. So what does that mean for the state of democracy today? You have an electorate that really doesn't trust the parties. You have two parties that seem not to be fulfilling some central role in convincing people that government does something for them or can be effective. Yet you also have voters who consistently vote for parties, and we have really no mechanism to get rid of them in democracy. So part of the motivation of this book is to kind of take issue with the way we think about parties right now. There is an extensive focus on parties as election getters. The only thing that matters to a political party is, does it win elections? And in fact, I think if you did a kind of general survey of what makes a party strong, people would say whether or not it wins majorities. But that overlooks a very storied tradition in particularly comparative politics that thinks about parties as thick institutions, those that are intermediaries, that are socially embedded, that represent different segments of the electorate with integrity, sometimes even at the expense of being able to win votes. And it is that function of political parties that is missing in our democracy today. So what follows is going to be a kind of cursory overview of the different chapters of the book and the arguments that are raised. I won't be able to go into great detail on any of them, but I'm happy to talk about them later or to see what the panelists think about them. So the first thing that I'm trying to convince people of is that parties are fundamental to democracy, which is something that we take for granted as political scientists, but I think the general public actually does not feel this way, and the press either. And part of the reason we know that parties are fundamental is because, as Schatzsnyder said, modern democracy is unthinkable save in terms of parties. In the era of limited democracy, there were proto-parties that were factions in the legislatures that did things like hold monarchs to account. But as you got the expansion of democracy through the expansion of suffrage to, say, non-property owning males, there needed to be some way to organize those newly enfranchised voters at a local level. So party organizations began to form, with local party agents going into local communities, registering people to vote, distributing early party pamphlets and newspapers. We had partisan media much earlier than we had objective media, and they printed party ballots. There actually used to be just vive voce voting. So you would just raise your hand for whichever party you supported. Of course, there were also spoils and patronage and that kind of thing. But what you had was an embedded set of local parties with party agents and kind of a visible presence of parties, particularly in the time of elections. And this is where you get parties that emerge as linkage organizations that are socially embedded and representative. Then if we kind of fast forward to the era of sort of democratic capitalism, when societies are moving from agrarian to industrial economies, and after particularly the world wars of World War II, there's a real question mark about whether or not democracy and capitalism can coexist, with well-known critics like Marx arguing that state institutions will inevitably replicate the power and economic divisions in society. So you can never really get a democracy that successfully manages capitalism. But in this time, what happened with parties, especially the expansion of parties on the left and social democratic parties, is a compromise of democratic capitalism, whereby a system of markets that could provide jobs and wages and innovation could be combined with robust states and governments that provided policies that just sort of made democracy safe for capitalism, public goods, infrastructure, and a sort of general safety net for workers. So parties were able to institutionalize a countervailing power to capital, to use John Kenneth Galbraith's formulation, because in a purely capitalist system, there is not necessarily a way to aggregate countervailing power, but political parties provide an institutional way to do that. However, a lot of these representative functions of parties have been challenged in the neoliberal era. I think there's another tendency in both the scholarship and in sort of the way we talk about parties to think of a lot of societal change as exogenous to the party. So we would say that, for example, we just entered a neoliberal era, or we entered a period of globalization, or technological and communications changes happened. So there's a sense that the party is always sort of defending itself against or adapting to changing external circumstances. Whereas I really try to argue that parties themselves embraced and furthered these changes from within to serve an increasingly electoral purpose, even if it traded off with some of their previously representative functions. There are a few things that have happened that I think we are all familiar with, but party organizations themselves have become far more professionalized, elite, and focused exclusively on the technology and machinery of election campaigns. There's been much less role for state and local parties in an era of nationalized parties. They have become sidelined. They're often hollow. So a lot of the research that I tried to do, even though it was during the pandemic, was just to locate what the local parties are. I tried to do this on like the Facebook pages of local parties or even on Google Maps. And they they barely exist. They might exist on paper. They might not have any individuals associated with them. And after the 2010s, that's where we've seen a lot of the extreme right, for example, begin to build local power. Steve Bannon did a podcast in which he recommended that people look up their local Republican Party organization. He said, you're very likely to find that it's empty. So you can just go there with some of your friends, sign up, become a local party chair, and then you can take over election administration. So this was a strategy that was promulgated on his podcast prior to 2020. But the reason is because state parties have very little role in the national party, and the national party doesn't really need state and local parties to do much. There's also been much less reliance on the affiliated groups that once constituted the core of parties, such as labor unions, or even just the student groups, women's groups, those kinds of groups that really emerged in an era of the mass organization party. And finally, there's also been, I won't say full convergence, but an increasing similarity between parties of the left and right on their economic approach to states and markets. So there are just two implications of some of these changes that I'll talk about here, although there are more in the book. The first is that the embrace of neoliberal orthodoxies, which was a cross-partisan political consensus, according to the sociologist Stephanie Mudge, eroded the distinctions between left and right that are crucial to the party system. So beginning in the 1980s, we of course associate the rise of neoliberalism with conservative politicians, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, et cetera. And parties in the left were in the political wilderness. They had lost many successive elections with seemingly no winning agenda. This might happen again to parties of the left. But the solution in the 1990s was to embrace a third way of politics that triangulated a lot of the issues of the right and moved towards a more global sort of economic agenda, where the goal was to transcend some of the partisan divisions that had once led to, say, an economic crisis in the 1970s, and instead embrace like this new post-Cold War era of peace and prosperity. So parties across the left and right embraced similar, although to different degrees, policies around deregulation of industry, globalization and free trade, and the dismantling of trade barriers, the WTO in the 1990s, and allowing markets to do more to solve problems rather than relying on states. So you hear attacks on government from across the aisle. There was a sense from politicians that by governing responsibly, i.e. managing the economy effectively, they would be able to do more for the electorate than governing responsively, i.e. doing exactly what it is voters say they want to do across a range of policy issues. It was rare that you would hear a positive case for government. There were many efforts to reinvent government in the 1990s, to reform government. Basically, every president has experimented with this. They all involve some kind of embrace of market terminology to make things more efficient, to marketize them, to create accountability, none of which is bad, but it does make it very difficult for any general member of the public to say what it is government does that distinguishes it from the private sector. And finally, it's also meant that the working class is increasingly politically homeless. Neither party really represents the working class through an economic agenda or through these ties from before, like trade unions. The level of unionization in the private sector is down to very low single digits, and it's not even that much better in Western Europe. And so instead, you have parties that increasingly reflect a educational cleavage, which you've probably heard about. Thomas Piketty and many others have written about it, where parties of the left represent highly educated and often high-income professional voters in cities. Parties of the right make a lot of working class appeals, but many of them are not programmatic. They're based on grievance or fear, resulting in what Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson have called the plutocratic populism, where they have an economic agenda for plutocrats, but use populist rhetoric to cobble together a working class coalition. Now, drawing on examples from other places around the world, like Latin America and Europe, after the Project of European Union in the 1990s, there's a lot of empirical evidence that these erosions of party differences in left and right generate more political instability. They produce more extremist candidates who can capitalize on the fact that voters aren't sure how to hold politicians to account when the policies are the same, and also increases the level of anti-system messaging in political campaigns. The second implication of some of these changes to party organization is that we've seen actually more delegation to non-party groups to do the work that parties used to do. So parties used to keep a lot of the work of campaigning, getting volunteers out in-house when, say, elections were much more labor intensive. But with the rise of reliance on campaign finance and high net worth donors to finance elections, and also the rise of the politics industry, so strategists and consultants and pollsters who can do a lot of the data work and micro targeting to get voters, you know, the annoying texts that you keep getting from parties asking you to vote every day is an emergency. None of that requires like in-person contact or any kind of deep socialization within the electorate. And increasingly, that work is not done by parties themselves. So the mobilization and get out the vote efforts can now be done by 501c4s and super PACs. There's some debate in the literature about whether or not these constitute an extended party network, whereby they're just kind of, you know, doing the dirty work of parties. But they don't. They may help parties achieve similar goals of getting specific candidates elected, but they are not parties in other incredibly important ways. They're not themselves elected officials who seek elected office and therefore will ever be held accountable by the public. They're often anonymous. Sometimes they have to report their money to the FEC, but they can report by being, you know, within not really shell companies, but LLCs and groups of people rather than listing themselves in their individual names. And after an FEC change to their rules in early 2024, they can now coordinate directly with individual campaigns on GOTV efforts. So it was a surprise in the 2024 election when Kamala Harris's enormous amounts of donations went to a traditional ground game, where in the swing states, they were going to kind of blitz areas that were known to be competitive to try to use, you know, traditional volunteers, get out the vote efforts, which has historically led to success. What was weird is that Elon Musk was running President Trump's entire ground game. At the time, the press indicated that this was, or, you know, sort of the feeling among political consultants was that this was destined to fail. This is a guy, Elon Musk, who doesn't really understand anything about politics. Super PACs are not themselves like political organizations that do a lot of campaigns, and yet it was a seemingly successful strategy. So before I get to that slide, I've been talking about this book for a while, and I hate it when people quote themselves and say, like, I said X. But I was kind of lazy and trying to see where I had already had some slides. In 2023, I went to a conference at the University of Virginia on democracy and capitalism. And I concluded that weaker parties were going to make it harder to manage capitalism, particularly in whatever kind of post-neoliberal stage we're in, where you have electorates that are a little bit wary of free trade, may want to go a little bit more protectionist, and where we have a lot of transnational problems. There's a lot more inequality, none of which I even talked about here. So I said a few things, like maybe there will be more outsourcing of representation. Maybe there will be more role for the private sector to shape civil society itself. And maybe there's more pressure on corporations to address political and social problems, all of which I think were true. What I did not anticipate is when I said outsource governance to the private sector, that this would happen. They're literally the world's richest man, as Steve said to me, this is like a bad James Bond movie, where the world's richest man goes up to the Department of Treasury and says, give me all this info, I'm taking it, with seemingly no effect so far. So I'll leave it there. I'll say that we are in a I think, very bad place in American democracy that goes far beyond anything any one political party can do. When we get to a place where democracy has been somewhat stabilized and the people who have been committing crimes are held to account, then I think that building stronger political parties also very much needs to be part of democratic renewal. Thank you.
All right, now to cheer us up a bit, Julia.
Great. That's a tall order. Thank you. Thank you, Didi, for this great book. Thank you all for having me here. Thank you, Bruce, for that great introduction. It's really great to be here in some California weather. I live in Wisconsin. And it's not every day you get to sit in a room with a friend who's my friend for the better part of a decade now, and really embarrass the hell out of her by congratulating her on a great book. So I'm really excited to be here, and I want to celebrate Didi's book in true academic fashion by asking a bunch of questions. And to give you kind of an overview, the themes I want to focus on are asymmetry between the parties, the nationalization of American politics, which is a really strong theme throughout the book, and I want to sort of pull out some more detail about that, and then the kind of historical contingency of the turning points in party politics. And I hope to, by doing that, put Didi's book a little bit in conversation with some other scholarship on the evolution and weakening of political parties. So here, I'm going to rephrase your main contention and then give you the opportunity to tell me this is wrong. Your main contention is that political parties, particularly in the US, are failing to live up to their central role and what the book calls representation. I'm going to provocatively rephrase here as empowering less powerful groups in society. And it seems to me like power is really running through this account of what parties are supposed to do. So when we talk about linkages, we talk about representation a lot in the parties literature, but what we're really talking about here is what you had said in one of your earlier slides, which is having a countervailing source of power to capital. And this is where I became obsessed to an unhealthy degree with the chapter on the third way. So this is something that, as the presentation suggests, that Didi identifies as a key turning point, is the third way and the Democratic Party's turn to centrism. And this chapter outlines the history and identifies the third way and the DLC as kind of an anti-party project, which I thought was really quite fascinating. And it makes some provocative claims that on page 73, she wrote this group of sentences that I just am obsessed with. Moving to the center does not entail a specific political agenda. The political center is a nondescript place, a non-existent voter, yet it looms large in the public imagination. So this is, I think, really quite striking if you put it in conversation with the polarization literature, where we've been talking about the disappearing center for 20 years, right? 30 years. It's been a central tenet of that literature. So this argument is a challenge to that, suggests that what we might have conceived of as the center was really a pluralistic combination of different interests being represented. And the idea of a center is, in fact, both a recent and a deliberate invention. So I kind of want to just invite you to say more about whether, are you talking about the same thing? When you talk about centrism and the DLC and Third Way, Democratic Leadership Council, those projects, when you talk about centrism as that project, do you think you're signifying the same thing as when we talk about the center in these polarization conversations? And if so, are you rebuking decades of polarization scholarship, which I am here for? I love that for you. I'm here for that. And a further provocative claim that I think sort of elaborates from that is that electability, the Democrats' sort of obsession with electability, has undermined representation. The second kind of question that I want to advance has to do with, really comes out to, can folks hear me, by the way? I realized I didn't check to see if my mic was on. To what extent is this primarily an account of the Democratic Party? And I find myself asking this question about a lot of party books. And so this speaks directly to this conversation about party asymmetry in the American politics literature, and this idea that the Democrats are a party of groups, Republicans are the party of ideology, and also this is the Grossman and Hopkins argument from 2016. The Republicans are really the party of kind of the dominant groups in society, and so that's a fundamental asymmetry. That seems very important to your thesis to me. And you really emphasize one of the most important aspects of party politics is this linkage between those who have financial power or other kinds of power and those who don't. Those linkages would seem to be quite different for Republicans and Democrats because of that history. And because that, it seems like there's sort of a, this sort of couches your Great Retreat story in a new way. The emergence of neoliberal centrist policy does suggest some asymmetry. And as I'm wondering, should we think about these linkage functions in a fundamentally kind of different way? Do the parties actually do different things in their linkage functions? So this brings me to a couple other lines of inquiry. To put your book in the larger context of the party decline literature, Didi and I have sat next to each other at many of these practitioner conferences, some here at Stanford, and I think the story we usually tell each other at these conferences is that the decline of party strength is largely an unintended consequence of institutional changes or the growth of what Sam Rosenfeld and Danny Schlossman call para-party organizations in their recent book, The Hollow Parties. There are accounts that stress kind of the corruption of the traditional linkage parties you talk about in the 19th century and the reform movements that brought them down. I really like that you identify a moment that's not the McGovern-Fraser primary reforms. But again, good luck sort of, dislodging some of that logic. So I think your emphasis on this third way moment in the 1990s prompts other questions, and it made me paranoid. It made me ask questions about, should we stop thinking about the decline of parties and anti-party sentiment that's grown along with it as an unintended byproduct of institutional change or other forces. The 1990s story suggests, I think, some historical contingency. It just happens to be the Democrats are in the political woods when this happens, and they're casting about for a strategy. But also, if a major function of political parties is to spread out political and economic power, should we start looking for signs of their more deliberate destruction? And are the 90s the place to start looking? Seems like, we treat this as something that just happened, and maybe that's not true. Just to bring the asymmetry and nationalism or nationalized politics thing together, I'd just like to hear you maybe talk a little bit more about that story of how parties have gone from local and state to having to compete in this more nationalized environment. And that it seems like your story is Democrats turn to anti-party centrism to bridge that gap. And so I'm thinking about this. I wish I had more optimistic things to say about 2025. I wish I felt better. But my question this morning was, are the Democrats at the national level too far gone? Is this, can they function as a national party, or did they kind of only work in this other context? Are they either party capable of engendering the trust that intermediary level requires? This takes us to another, I think, point about historical contingency. Are political parties as fundamental as we like to say they are they actually the product of a particular moment in the 19th century where the big problem was to nationalize, right, to bring together all these diverse geographical constituencies, and that's not the problem anymore. So maybe there's some other problem that needs to be solved. And this is kind of my bigger question about, can we rehabilitate parties in the public mind? Does the public distinguish between the 501c3 and the consultants on the one hand versus the parties, and should they? And so that is my extremely not encouraging note that I want to end on. So I hope I've given you a couple questions to think about here. Thank you.
Okay. Jake, you're up.
All right. I have a couple just picture slides. Amy, is there an easy way to get that?
She's coming.
No problem if not. Just those pictures. Appreciate you. Hard to go after Didi and Julia, both brilliant scholars, and along with Bruce, like they have good jokes that actually is not typical in this industry.
Jokes.
Yeah, well, supposed to set expectations low. So as we get some pictures up there, so I just want to continue. So I think that was one segue that I think is just critical of what Julia just said. Before I get into some praise, is that this is a book about parties and democracy rather than parties and representation. It's a book about parties and their central role in democracy and democratic institutions, both in the narrow sense of just thinking about the rule of law and the peaceful transfer of power and elite forbearance, which under threat now, in Didi's later slides, that part comes up, as well as throughout the book, the more expansive political equality, majoritarian first dimension of democracy as well. And I myself, along with people in this room, have debated on the relative importance of these dimensions of democracy, but both of those come out in the book, and increasingly right now in this moment, the role of parties in both of those. And then another piece of just sort of praise of the book as a piece of social science is, with the rapid changing of everything going on at the institutional, math, behavioral, technological, financial, political, economic levels, legal levels, so many, you cannot do this. I'm a behaviorist and I'm going to go into the neurology of the mass voter brain and ask why they're so tribal, or I'm going to go and do a just rational choice on, media firm acquisition and merger. It's like you have to do a bit of it all. And you have to do it developmentally, and that's really nicely shown in this book. The feedbacks between the development of political institutions, politics and mass and organizational politics, the economy, and political parties and their interactions. That is absolutely crucial to have all those moving parts to understand these transformations over time. I also want to shout out like just how unique Didi's focus is on a section called Democracy and Capitalism in Crisis, a section on the development of third way politics. Those are like highly underemphasized, especially in American political science, and really crucial in comparativists. And that's another thing, mixing in a bit American focus with comparative politics. This is a crucial piece of Didi's contribution too, and taking wisdom that is more emphasizing comparative politics about those relationships. Now I'll move into sort of a piece of news that gives us some thoughts about Julia's provocation about the Democratic Party. So Quinnipiac poll just came out, and I looked back. This is Democratic-based voters' views of Democratic members of Congress. In October 24, it was plus 54 approval of Democratic Party members of Congress. February 2025, today, it is -8. Like massive shift, massive disapproval by the bases of their own political parties. The Democratic Party is as ripe for a takeover. There are very strong political, economic, and social capital-based differences across the parties in terms of this, but this is ripe for an outside takeover. This is the Tea Party era was about the Republican Party being ineffective at stopping liberalism and particularly immigration, where an elite consensus between the parties was more sort of business and permissive immigration friendly in the Bush Republican era and Democratic Party's 2000s era than the median Republican voter. And that insurgency did both cause some challenges for the electability of Republicans, but it also broke out an elite consensus and made, at least on the immigration policy dimension, this much more responsive to the Republican median voter. And to some extent, I would say the American median voter, despite my sort of policy disagreements with that position. And then moving forward, I want to say there are three big structural changes that I think we should just talk about as major shocks to the system. I generally, I cannot tell you how much I'm like nodding and agreeing with what Didi's saying. This is another provocation of I, as well as Didi and all of us, we look towards previous models of functioning institutions to understand how to build future institutions. And the cliche of we need a socially embedded, decentralized federal structure of party systems that's based in state and local party systems that are aligned with labor unions, community religious organizations that are not extremist, local business, and so forth, with in-person social interaction is like the cliche I've been saying my entire career as well. It's very important that at the same time, I have been shocked that the 2024 election was the most online election I have ever seen. Didi's great point about the Musk takeover of the Republican ground game, A++, there was no Republican ground game and it didn't matter. Like all of our experiments that we ran in the field of canvassing, actually now died. Like this is just the post-COVID era, the ubiquitous smartphone era. Smartphones are antitrust injection machines. Like it is a shock that I don't actually see as there's asymmetry across social constellations and parties and ideologies and issue areas, but they are antitrust machines. Not just the typical study of misinformation and disinformation with a malevolent person in Macedonia putting them in, it's also just the extrapolation from noise. The idea that you have a platform, regardless of rising through a state and local institution, where there's some filtering through a labor union. You're pretty good at organizing workers. You're pretty good as a religious leader at keeping the community together. Those institutions don't matter anymore. And the currency is now virality. And virality is associated, I'm going to get mildly behavioral. I don't like it. But it's associated with different.
Well,
yeah, it's a different, thank you, Hakeem. It's a different sort of space than rational choice, I would say. Another big thing that, again, Didi did hit on in this is that, I think Didi's focus on economic inequality, on third way politics is so refreshing, so incredibly important, takes from comparativists who study labor, inequality, democracy, Carlos Boyce, all types of people. Here, though, we're in a different era. This is a figure on the x-axis is the start of your net worth at the beginning of 2024. The y-axis, your gain in net worth over the year 2024. The more billions you started with, the more billions you got. This is a fundamentally different era. Elon Musk is not only the richest man in the world, he's the richest man in human history. Like, this is a fundamentally different structure. And moving into contributions, like I love campaign finance reform as much as the next guy, but there is a challenge where even in hard money contributions, the top 100 Republican contributors make up 50% of Republican hard money financing. This is not even dark money. And this is not even buying media firms or social media platforms and networks. This is a fundamentally different space. And the old campaign, I would get in arguments and say, Citizens United doesn't seem good for democracy. We should have more restrictions on money politics. And there would be a group of legal scholars often would say, hey, you can try to dam that river of money. It's just going to go around. Like, this is pointless. And I did think of, I think that's a very important point. You also have to boost mass sort of voice in politics through something like labor organization and other. You can't just stop the money water flow. It will circumvent barriers. But we're at a level where that metaphor is just quaint. Like, this is just a new level where one person really can take over a party in a different way if they have that prerogative. That's all the pictures I have. I think Didi is at the cutting edge of thinking about this. I think where parties fit in the renewal of democratic and small r Republican institutions within a country like the US, and thinking about what can we not put back in the bottle, the genie and the cat's out of the bag, whatever metaphor, but the nationalization of politics is out of the bag. Fundraising is national and global. Attention is national and global. That era does feel over. Does the in-person associational civil society membership organization survive this? Where I used to constantly say, if I was advising a political campaign, do not spend all your money online. Like, you got to go build community in real life in this federated political system. I just don't know. Those are lingering questions, but political parties, due to very strong things we knew since the beginning of the party literature, their role as aggregators of preferences within complicated institutions, and their roles as heuristics of political choice will not die in this period. Where do they fit in? And really thank Didi for writing this book, and great to see you.
Okay, so I go last here, and since some of the points were covered, I will just acknowledge some agreement with earlier people. I want to start actually with, as both of them did, talking about what I really liked about the book and what I think is distinctive about the book. One, which I think both Jake and Julie have mentioned, is the real tie to economic, social change historically, and locating parties and party structure within this context. It raises a deep question of, to what extent do some of the things that we normally identify, like campaign finance reform and other institutional changes, like the introduction of primaries, which I wrote about in my book, to what extent are they the cause of the problem that we have right now? And to what extent is it an artifact of the fact that globalization means we don't have stable neighborhoods anymore, that labor is going in and out, that we communicate in a completely different way than the way we used to, which makes it very hard to rely on the party machines and all that. So I think it's important to put it in that context, but I'm going to come back to that because I think in some ways the book leaves it as an open question about what the contribution of these two things are, but it does us a service by saying they're both there. Okay. Secondly, I think the other piece there, and I think I like to think I might have had some role in this because I've been whining about it for 10 years and I've been on a lot of those with these people. And I whine over and over again about we're not looking at the impact of professionalism on our politics. And finally, somebody wrote a whole chapter on that. And I would like to take credit for whining.
It was all you.
Yes. And I really do think that while it's not sort of a fundamental cause in the way the socioeconomic context is, it's definitely a contributing cause. And it fits, I think, very nicely with your thesis of the hollowing out as we contract out to consultants. Their focus obviously is on getting the person elected, not on building the party. And we had this big discussion way back, and who was it, the senator from, or not the senator, the governor from Vermont that took over the party. I'm blanking on his name because
Howard Dean.
The screamer.
Howard Dean, yeah.
There you go.
Yes. But in between his screams was a rational thought, which is we should be thinking about building the party base. And that was a big discussion, 20 years ago. I remember. And I do think this whole question of the outsourcing, of not only the campaigning, but you also bring in the think tanks that we handed over the thinking of policy to eggheads like us. And we get some things right, but we're not in the community necessarily sensing the pulse of what is on people's minds. And that, of course, I think is kind of the part of behind the shock that people have about what happened. It was bad enough that he won the electoral college, but that he actually won the popular vote. And that's really, I think, has shaken the Democratic Party to the core about, well, okay, he won that by taking people that were sitting on the sidelines that were unhappy with both parties, which Didi talks about, and he found a way to mobilize them. Why were the Democrats not able to do that? And is it built in to what Jake was talking about?
Can you switch? It's just a little bit hard to hear you.
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. Is it better now? Okay.
Yes.
All right. I don't have to repeat everything, do I? No. Okay. It wasn't worth it anyway. Okay. So I do think that this whole business of consultants is both an artifact of the times that you're discussing with respect to the socioeconomic changes and also a contributor. And I think it's a great service that you did that. And it stops me from whining, which is another great service. And thirdly, I think this is the part that I sort of struggle with, and I'm going to come back to in a second, which is, in your earlier discussion of what function the parties played in the early industrialization, you rightly point out that these machines did more than generate policy and abstract policy. That their heyday was a period in which they were providing a lot of material benefits for immigrants and others. They were providing jobs, et cetera. And this links to a discussion that's been going on in Washington for 20 or 30 years, which was it a good idea to get rid of earmarks? Was it a good idea to sever the connection that people in elected office have to actual material consequences in the districts? And that was not a discussion that was easy to have when, particularly in the 90s, when Newt Gingrich was coming into power and the Democratic Party did some things that were, the banking scandal and the rest. It was just, there was a real kind of effort from one wing of the Democratic Party to purify politics, to make it less about side benefits and payoffs and jobs. And we at the Institute of Governmental Studies, where Jake sometimes now must walk through, we're known under Nelson Polsby and Bruce Kane as the Institute of Bad Politics, because we kept raising these questions about the purification of politics. To what extent is that a good idea? And it leads, I think, Didi, to some questions about whether or not, if you were to get your dream and restore those connections, would it be Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders you get, or would it be something far more like what Trump is giving people, which is short-term benefits to the neglect of long-term problems like climate change, like automation and the rest? What he's giving them is a show, yes, but also, when he did his COVID checks, they had his name on it. Okay,
Yeah,
he understands that part of politics has always been material, even though there's been the shift. And the more we get to abstract, and the more we get to away from negative liberty and into positive liberty, to use the Democratic phrase. In other words, the more we're not about the people's freedom to choose, but what's good for them, the more we become an any party, which does not fit the culture in the United States as well as it does in some other countries, because this is a culture that very much negative freedom and allowing people to make choices in markets. So there is this underlying cultural problem. We have to somehow think about these long-term problems and not always about the short term, but how do we do it in such a way that we still stay in power? I think is much more of a challenge for the Democratic Party, which gets me to what Julia said. I put it in red to just remind me that you said it first. My wife says that I always steal her points and I don't give her credit, so I'm very sensitive on this issue. But because it's true, of course. But anyway, I digress. It is more a story about Democrats than Republicans. And she gave you one spin on that. I'll give you a slightly different one. Her spin is completely right, but my spin is an additional thought that when you think about it, the Republican Party has stayed connected through Bush with the churches. He brought in the churches and the Christian right. And so he had that organization to work from. The rallies had a social purpose that goes back to the 19th century when people went around the country and had big rallies. And so he made them into festive events where his sense of humor, such as it is, seemed to entertain people, right? So I'm not sure that the Republican Party story is the same as the Democratic Party story, and you can come back on it, but don't worry, I can see you're ready to tell me why I'm wrong. But anyway, and I'm also not sure that the whole story about the sort of centrism is true of the Republican Party. To me, it is true that the Democratic Party in the most recent years, you see a surge in the more liberal component of the party where that had been decimated from the Clinton years. And so you didn't have, it was, even Kerry couldn't call himself a liberal, let alone a progressive, okay? So there was a period in which the liberal category really got diminished in the Democratic Party. But the Republican Party has stayed pretty consistent in terms of its demography. It's still largely a white party. It still has a manufacturing base. It's still, it acquired after Jimmy Carter, the religious vote, and the Democratic Party became more secular. And secular, by the way, doesn't have institutional organization for it. It's just secular, okay? So I do think that you need to rethink. I agree with Julia. I think it's the Republican side of it, I think, is a part that you should think through a little bit more, because I'm sure you're right to some degree, because they certainly fit the story that you have about the convergence on trade, but then they changed. Trump figured out that friendshoring and bringing manufacturing back was getting some people potentially, even though he didn't deliver on that, just the fact that he was talking about it seems to have made a difference to the election outcomes. Anyway, I'm also not sure that bringing back party intermediaries the way you want to, and I've already said this, so I won't say it again, or I won't dwell on it again, which is to what extent the party intermediaries will do what you want them to do, which is the Howard Dean, restore a real interest in vital redistributive politics and the democratic agenda, or whether people are still caught in the everyday problems of life, and that might be hard to do. And I'm not sure that attempts to go back to that kind of structure will work, because look at the attempt that Nancy Pelosi and others had to create the superdelegates, and that the superdelegates were going to bring back that intermediation again. And then when you looked at it very carefully, the superdelegates were afraid of annoying all the other delegates, and because many of them were elected officials. And so ultimately, the base of the party, having less insulation because of social media, because of the way the primaries operate, because of the kind of the way electoral politics works, it's not clear that they would perform the function even if they were given it to be the intermediaries. And moreover, the intermediaries that people like me and Rick Pildos talk about are people that would engage more in exactly the kind of compromise that gives you a stomachache. But the reality is, we believe that the parties have to be part of bringing back conversation, because the nature of the structure of American politics requires bargaining. And I'm afraid that
while we have to have people that, believe very strongly in the grassroots on their, very liberal and very conservative people, ultimately the country has to move forward. And that's what we haven't figured out, is how to do that in an effective way. So I'm not sure, because towards the end of the book, more and more, this preference that you have for a more vigorous part of politics is there, and you and I may always disagree about that and to what extent. But I'm not sure that the party, if you're going to have that more vigorous politics, I think it's going to have to be a kind of conversion of people recognizing whatever it is Trump's going to give us for 4 years and how it doesn't work, and then capturing that moment to show, hey, these are teaching moments about why you need to have government, why you have to have regulation, why you have to be safety. Because the older you get, the more you see that there are cycles in terms of how people understand politics and government. And we're in a cycle now where the learning will be what happens if you really rely too much on deregulation and detaxation. And I think what the Democratic Party has to prepare for is this experience of learning, which will happen over the next 4 years, because we're going to let Trump be Trump because we've given him permission and the rest. And so we'll see how far he goes. The one thing I will finish on is everybody since about 1980, the administrations have come in, except for, they get one term, but none of them ever finish with a trifecta government. And it's usually the same thing, that you come into power, you pay off your debts to the primary people, and then because you know that, you're even going to be more ambitious is what they've done. And then what you have is divided government and 3 years of stalemate. So I think these two parts of you, which is one, the restoration of parties, and then the more vigorous energization of progressive politics, I'm not sure they fit, but that's just my thought. Okay. So I think what we want to do is open it up to questions. And I don't know whether Didi needs to say anything, or should we just open it up to questions?
Just open it up.
Yeah, let's open it up. So are we handing the mic around?
No. You're controlling it. And it's questions, not lectures or statements.
Oh, okay. And that's me controlling it, not.
Yep. You should.
Yes, I got it. Okay.
Is this a democracy?
No,
it is.
no. It's
The iron
it's a-
fist in a velvet glove.
Exactly, exactly. And I know how to duck. So, okay, yeah. Yes, right here.
Yes.
Seamus.
Hi.
James.
It has
I
been
know.
somewhat famously observed that we haven't just seen kind of a retreat of these like local party organizations, but that we've also seen a retreat of like bowling leagues,
Yes.
perhaps. Also of like, church attendance, maybe the number of Elks lodges we have. And so kind of my question is, one, do you see this as a part of that broader trend? And two, if it's a part of that broader trend, is this something we know how to fix, or have we lost that ability to kind of engage in these sorts of like local grassroots community organizations as a culture or as a country?
Okay, should we answer now?
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, thank you. The wonderful thing about having a book done is when I used to give this talk, people would say all these things I should do, and I was like, oh God, now I have to go do that. I don't have to do any of that. I will say there are amazing postdocs and political scientists here and students who should all tackle the very important questions that my esteemed colleagues are but no, those were super helpful. And I think like one of the, I won't say it's pessimism, but I would say a through line between the set of comments is like, I try not to say there was a golden age of parties, but there certainly was a time when we were more civic and bowling and such. And I was also a student of Theta Scotch Bowl, and that's very much influenced my thinking clearly. But I don't think that we can get rid of parties. Now, it's true that parties are going to like have linkage functions and mechanisms that look very different moving forward. In the book, the sort of decline of civic life more generally is seen as something that is endemic to society, like it's a social change that has occurred, rather than one that is like uniquely related to party. But the argument is basically that it doesn't help. And parties certainly have, like, as they are themselves becoming weaker in various ways, there's also this kind of atrophying social fabric that makes it much more difficult to establish the kinds of representative ties that you would want. But I think on that, by the time we're talking about like civil society and civic organization, then it's really difficult to think of solutions. Like, while I think that we can rebuild parties because we do ultimately have self-interested legislators and like voters who need to make sense of the world and things like that, I'm not sure if we'll ever like spend our Thursday nights not on Netflix, as our friend Lily Mason one time said. She's a scholar of polarization. And I was like, why aren't people getting together? And she was like, because of Netflix. But we have a colleague, Eitan Hirsch, who's written about political hobbyism. And this kind of is related to Jake's point about social media and the way that we socialize these days. People find communities online. The people who are the most polarized, according to his analysis, are those who are really actively engaged online, but not in their communities. Whereas people who actually go get involved in like fixing the potholes are the ones who then are able to deliberate and compromise in the way that Bruce and Rick talk about. So, I don't think that we're going to get elk lodges, although there is a Masonic temple, not temple, but like lodge in Palo Alto. And every time I walk by, I'm like, who's in there? But I think we need to at least do something about, creating a visible, like dense party. But I don't know if that's going to be a top, like a civic organization that doesn't exist anymore. But colleagues, yeah.
Can I, or go ahead.
Or Joy, can they chime in?
Oh, it's your party.
Yes.
It's your
Yes,
party.
Jake,
Jacob.
everyone chime.
I will try to make this brief. I think thinking comparatively, like I do think this has hit, like Didi shows, every country, but I do think proportional representation systems have been ever so slightly insulated from this. And one reason is that, Bruce has talked a lot about the institutional reforms of the American party system, but if you poll primary election voters in the US, particularly on the Democratic side, they're entirely pundit brained. They're only second order preferences of electability, navigation, who's going to win. There is so minimal voting on first order actual policy positions. And to give people a general election, they're also overlaid with federalism in the US. There's so many damn off cycle and on cycle elections at different levels, to the point where I do think I would have liked a little PR discussion could have maybe aligned people's voting behavior and forced order principles and decline pundit brain ever so slightly. Maybe not.
Provocative. I don't know.
Okay.
Can I chime in briefly? I think the civic association question is an important one, and it's an empirical one that I don't know the answer to. But I think the other dimension, I'm obsessed with power today and every day.
Today?
But I think like that's often what scholars of American politics aren't thinking about when we think about this stuff. I don't think it's that people aren't getting together. I suspect that's uneven across different kinds of communities. I think the problem is people aren't willing to surrender power to somebody who says, okay, I'm our local party leader and we're going to do this thing, and it may not be your first choice. I think there's a deeper breakdown of the social contract in some ways, but I don't actually think it's about face-to-face organization.
Okay. Another question in the back.
So thanks, this is great, and I have read books, so that's always an ability. But I'm thinking of this in comparative terms. And one of the things that it struck colleagues and me in doing work looking at parties and elections across states is just how different it looks to be a member of a party in different countries.
Yeah.
So that even in the sort of glory days of strong parties in the US, the sort of early days of parties of strong organizations, those were largely as machines, which were taking the role of welfare service provision and things like that, which later a strong capacitated state provides. And so parties no longer have that. Or parties as mobilizers, in a very basic way, when we have not an election day as mattering, but a period of time in which people might vote by mail or in person or in different days, that itself has changed. And so thinking about what it means to be part of a party, not just as a faction in government, but as an institution in society, as a civil society organization. I'm wondering if you could speculate a bit on what that should look like for parties to have a useful role. In other words, what role should parties effectively, rightly, usefully play in contemporary democracy beyond segmenting, voter interests? In other words, if to say that one is a member of the Democratic or Republican Party, what should that actually mean in terms of what they do or how they relate or how the individual engages or how the party engages?
Such a great question, Meredith, and a very hard one. So first of all, my first book was about the transition, such as it was, from clientelistic to programmatic politics in the US, and now we're seeing it just go right back to where it started. So that's fun. But we really are seeing like the breakdown of the like programmatic rule of law, neutral administration, and it's happening so fast in a shocking way. But the second chapter starts with this anecdote about Tammany Hall. Like, I don't really have a problem with machines or earmarks or pork. And I don't know, actually, I'd be so curious how the panelists feel. I think this emphasis on like parties being pure and unified and like never engaging in politics has been terrible for parties. Like there has to be a lot of bargaining and some of it has to be dirty. And like, I think that's fine. But in the transition to programmatic politics, you still maintain a partisan loyalty. Sure, you may not be getting like $5 from your party boss, but you therefore, that the Democratic Party is going to provide like funding for the infrastructure that you need in the city. And so you'll get a job that way instead. So it's a somewhat attenuated relationship, but someone is still meeting your material needs. They're just doing it through policy instead. And so I hear all of the sort of comments to sort of go back to what the panelists talked about the book being much more about the left than the right. Part of the reason is because the argument that parties are central to democratic capitalism has to do with whether or not they make an affirmative case for government. So like between markets and states, the states need to do something, and people need to be convinced that parties are going to provide them the things that they need. And the Republican Party in recent years has just not done that. Yes, they've been civic on some dimension. They, if you like are in your local gun club and you have an NRA membership, or if, you're evangelical or something, that might be some kind of tie to a party that I like. But you are not offering something that the government is going to do. Inequality, you don't care about inequality necessarily. You certainly don't care about like mitigating it through a policy response. And that's the reason that, there's more of a focus on the left, who traditionally has taken a much more active role in defending the state. But I guess to try to answer your question of what the party could look like, it would be parties that are much more robustly programmatic in a way that is huge to what the government is providing. And this party deinstitutionalization that like Alan Hicken and Rachel Riedel have written about says that in an era of like kind of neoliberal reforms around the world, a lot of parties have lost the ability to make programmatic commitments to voters because they are constrained in the kind of state benefits they can offer. And that severs like the most important way that parties can try to create loyalties and policy feedback loops and stuff over time.
Can I chime in on that with just like, I kind of thought about party weakness a lot and what this would sort of look like different from polarization. It seems to me that one thing would be that people would conceive of that membership in a positive way, as opposed to just understanding their party identification as negative. And also, I have this somewhere written in like an unhinged scribbling in this book about the fact that parties sort of standing in for someone's identity has taken the place of some of these other functions. So those would be kind of like two criteria that I would think about to think about more robust party organization.
Hakeem.
Well, you can. Well, people might have hard hearing. Okay.
You can project.
Yeah,
Of course you
Always
can.
use the mic.
Always use the mic.
Oh, okay.
Even Hakeem. So thanks, y'all. I of course want to ask about consultant brain because they're gonna talk about it all the time. But I more broadly want to ask about like party elite's relationship to their perceived constituencies.
Oh, yeah.
And here I think I mean more than just like a member of Congress's sort of relation to their particular constituency. But I just love to hear you all say something about what at least appears to be the case, that party elites seem to have some view of the broad party constituency is not knowing what's best for the party. Sort of, we're acting in a way that's reasonable. All these people asking for like us to fight don't understand. And so it seems that there's some relationship that party elites, I'm thinking here about the Democratic Party, some perception that they have of their broad constituency that seems to be getting in the way of what we might think of as a sort of more positive or at least some sort of hand in hand sort of relationship that we'd expect. It seems peculiar to me, but I'm not an expert in the space.
Go ahead.
I love that question. I think a number of mechanisms here. So the US has always had a relatively weak party system, in part because a candidate-centered, single-member district-based election system and incumbency advantage, constituency service, and the geographic distribution of politics in that way. Now you have this feature where you don't have the same pork or geographic constituency-based representation. It's all nationalized all the way down, attention, fundraising, and so forth. At the same time, you have highly candidate-centric, again, still fundraising, rising through the ranks of your party, redistributing money throughout your party. And my work, this is like my shameless plug with Adam Bonica here. We work on age and campaign finance that, median member of the US Congress, of just the House, the younger chamber is 68. The median dollar in American politics comes from a 66-year-old we found through a bunch of stats and record linkage. Full half of all money is from individuals above age 66. Reason for this is like the particular changes of the party system. So my point is like, this book has like remarkably like explained a huge number of the mechanisms for why the US Congress became so old in terms of representation. And I found that like totally fascinating. And then there is a sort of like protecting electoral threats, both through the primary and the general as the main mechanism. And we have a strong disconnect between political conflict, attention, nationalized, and geographic forms of representation that, again, I worry cannot be put back in the bag.
I don't know the answer to that question, but it's so hard. All I will say is that for a long time, there was still an incumbency advantage, and that was the conventional wisdom. But this new work by Porter and Truel and stuff showing that like through the nationalization and candidate centeredness of campaigns, we now have like a newbie advantage. So there's partly this is the mechanism of primaries as well, but people can get so much out of district money for these like insurgent campaigns that they can do pretty well, like people with no political experience. And that's weird because their constituency is like tied to a geographic district, but those are not the people who really support them. And so through the sort of architecture of safe seats, if you are the Republican and you win your primary, then you can win your general, but you might just have like a donor base of supporters who is completely unrelated to who you represent. I will say there's some stuff in the book about the affluence bias in policymaking overall. So like, even though we as the United States have a much more porous campaign finance system and sort of laissez-faire approach to campaign money, and we think of the Western European countries as far more regulated, which they are, we still see there a reflection of affluent interests in policymaking and a lot of sort of like pro-capital type policies and the same deregulation, like economic orthodoxies, all of these trends. And that means it's not just a campaign finance issue. There's something in the political system where legislators are more oriented towards the preferences of those with more money or higher status, even when they represent districts that are composed primarily of low and middle income voters. And that is, at least it's like not comforting that it's a pattern, but it's something that's not just in the United States.
Okay, I'm going to take the prerogative of asking you a question.
Oh, okay.
So I'm struggling with the idea that that the current sort of network-based party is actually weaker as a party than the party. And I'll cite two facts for the Democratic Party, which you regard as the most devastated by changes. One is that when Nancy Pelosi was speaker, she was able to control the Democratic caucus, which was more variant in many ways than the Republican caucus. And so she was able to be the most effective speaker we have seen in the 20th century. Is this just because she's a woman, or is it because maybe you've underestimated the degree to which there is party and that it's unfortunately linked by money and access to money? So second thing is, when it became obvious that Joe Biden would not debate or probably even make decisions, it's amazing how quickly he was disposed of. And it was not done in a way that we'd ever seen before. So once again, if we're talking about a party that intervenes to put a better candidate, and whether Kamala lost or not, it doesn't matter. She was a much better candidate. You'd have to be an idiot to think otherwise. So we have two instances in which the party acted like a strong party. So how do you reconcile this?
Sometimes things off the regression line.
Well, I go back to VOP.
That's weak. Very weak.
Okay, so VOP distinguished between it was key, right? Parties in the electorate, parties in government, and parties as organizations. I think that in the era of polarization, parties in government have been very party-like. They vote together much more so than in eras past. And there are any number of reasons that that's the case, but that doesn't mean that they are like socially embedded and
Now,
representative.
wait a minute. What about the Republican Party? Underneath,
Kevin McCarthy.
It was
Those
Kevin
12
McCarthy
votes
all the
for
way
Speaker.
through to Johnson.
It's very
It-
recent. Super recent. That's like the past, I don't know, that's like what
but
most of the was
Oh, so this is another error term here. We're accumulating a lot of error terms that are off the line here. Okay.
okay.
I've given both these matters a lot of thought, and I've written on the second question about what a strong party have done, what the Democrats did this summer. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
But I think the Pelosi, I haven't thought as much about the congressional, but I think the Pelosi example is very illustrative because why is Pelosi so powerful? Part of it is she knows legislative process very well, but she got where she is because she's an amazing fundraiser, right? And I think it's illustrative that no one else has been able. I mean, she was what, 82 at that point. No one else has been able to take that position. The Democratic Party is very focused on individuals, and there's a very small number of individuals who've been able to step into these roles for whatever reason. A stronger party would have a stronger bench. And I think that's also the answer with the Biden question about why was this a scramble in July? A stronger party would have said, I'm sorry, this does not seem viable. But it's not just that it didn't happen, it's that it's not even on the table. A party cannot, and they used to be able to. Daniel Klingard has a really good piece from 2005 laying out the history of this. That parties could decline to nominate an incumbent president. And that is just not even viable. So that's my answer. I'll send you the piece. You can tell me why I'm wrong.
Do you want to jump in?
I don't know that I think of the nomination this past year as like a sign that the Democrats did their job. Yeah.
I think it's a spectrum. I do think that was like elements of, I joked like, that really contradicts our long running conventional theory in poli sci that Democratic Party management is really poor.
Yeah.
But like, these things happen. But I want to say, sorry, Didi mentioned that large, great theory of the Republican Party coalition. She mentioned the Hacker-Pearson sort of plutocratic populism. When your economic platform, like cutting the Affordable Care Act and high-end tax cuts, is not playing that well, you have an incentive, Ziblatt said, to introduce other forms of conflict, religious, racial, immigration-based, so forth. I think that's largely true, but Trump too, what I'm really seeing is like Juan Lin's perils of presidentialism, and we're in a different thing where I don't even know how to talk about the party system in this way, where is Putin's Russia a part, like what is that party system? Where right now it is, there's not one. It's different because now what is happening is an individual as a member of a party, a leader of a party, Donald Trump, has a lot of leverage, even over the richest man in history, Elon Musk, by saying, like, nice company you got there, like, this level of presidential sort of like hostage taking / latent threat, that's different than like what you could do to manufacturers in the industrial era. Like that exposure to regulation or antitrust or whatever is different, and has brought the oligarchs in to bend the knee in a different way, has meant that like the Russia-garchy analogy has become much more clear to me than the plutocratic populism 2017 era. And what do we even call that? Because it's nominally Republican Party stuff, but I just don't even know.
Just to quickly, exactly.
Familiar.
But I was going to say, I really hesitated to use the word oligarchy in my book. And in the final chapter, it's not really about parties. It's really about what happens when parties are not managing capitalism. And the examples that I used were like Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan giving $500 million to election administration, or Bill Gates like vaccinating all of the global south. It was that the government is just not going to do shit. There's going to be huge problems, and we're going to beg our billionaires to come in and solve these. But I didn't really think we'd have oligarchy. I didn't think that there would just be massive wealth defense and destruction of the institutions, and like all of this bending the knee and capitulation right off the bat, because there were these efforts during Trump 1 for corporations to be like, well, we're kind of civic and we're kind of moral and we don't really like this, but like, no, that's all disappeared overnight. So I do think that we're talking about something different now. Ezra Klein had a good column a few days ago that party was never supposed to trump the institution. Like separation of powers was actually supposed to be set of horizontal accountability. And now when party transcends that, but it's not party, you're right. It's like, it is this, I don't know, it's quasi-authoritarian. But when that transcends like the divisions that are so clearly outlined between the branches, then you really have a problem. Then you have no accountability in the office of the president.
At the end of the table, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Jim Goldgeier. So great event. Congrats. Can't wait to read the book. Super excited. So I want to ask you about the connection between ideas and a party and how those change over time. And of course, I am focused right now on the Trump moves on Russia, Ukraine. And I think about a Republican Party, I mean, when Ronald Reagan, a conservative Republican, was preparing to meet Mikhail Gorbachev for the first time, Newt Gingrich said, "This is the worst appeasement since Chamberlain met Hitler at Munich." Okay, now that we're at the worst appeasement at Munich, Republican Party, like this is, it's gone, right? I mean, people talk about, oh, there's people whispering, Roger Wicker's upset. Like, how do those ideas change so dramatically?
I have no idea. I mean, it's Larry's behind you. Larry and Frank on the board of the Net, watching this institution just freaking crumble. And Steve's daughter worked there. Like, we have these democracy promotion institutes. I worked at NDI. I worked at and the democracy promotion architecture that was created, we have 5 minutes left, thank you, Amy, after the end of the Cold War was bipartisan. And so much of it was actually created by Republicans in the Cold War. And the idea that having more democracy and development around the world doesn't serve our interests is absolutely insane to me. Even after democracy promotion got sullied in the early 2000s, after the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, there's still liberal internationalists who believe that people deserve freedom and rights around the world. And they have fought to the death for it. They continue to. So I have no idea what kind of ideas are in the Republican Party right now, except like nihilistic authoritarian. I don't even know, like authoritarian is kind of wrong, just like purely isolationist and short-sighted. But I open that to the group, like Catherine.
May I talk about Russia for a moment?
You may.
When Russia's not relevant, Canada is. So
The 51st state. Oh, sorry.
right. So, I think the commonality here is deinstitutionalization, right? And now it's deinstitutionalization of the state, right? So why? And hyper-personalization of politics. Okay, this is very familiar to those of us who studied Russia over the last 25 years in particular. But there was also a suspicion of parties and institutionalization even right off the bat in Russia because of the communist background. So that's obviously quite different. What's the purpose, though, of the deinstitutionalization and personalization? Well, it's to use the levers of the state as vehicles for self-enrichment. So this is very familiar, I think, and to enhance the unevenness of the playing field. So you get rid of things like diversity, equity, and inclusion because that's making things even. Well, that's not what the goal is here. The goal is to make things uneven, right? And so the richest man in the world, the richest man in history gets richer. And okay, so that's also familiar in the Russian context. And then a transactional approach to everything.
Yeah.
There are no values. There is only zero. Well, there's not. Yeah, it's a zero sum game. There's you or there. I guess there are no zero sum games. There's always a win and a loss. And this is very problematic, as Bruce said, for a system that depends on log rolling, right? The Russian system doesn't depend on that. It's one guy, it seems, although we used to think that he was somehow constrained by people around him and by society. Once you threaten the use of force, and we haven't quite seen that yet in the US, but rule by law as opposed to rule of law is, I think, an emerging possibility. Then, we're not a democracy anymore. So it's not just parties that are being hollowed out, it's everything that's being hollowed out. And the idea of, taking property and what's in it for me, I think one of the worrisome things about Trump and Putin right now is, first of all, they both think this way. right? The Republicans are evidently allowing Trump, encouraging him even to think more this way. And then second, as you think about what has happened with Ukraine more recently in the last 24 hours, this is a guy in the United States who's talking about, yes, taking Canada, my home country, by the way, we don't want to join. Mike can tell you about what really happened in the War of 1812 because I've explained it to him many, many, many times. This White House got burned down. But Trump wants to take Greenland. If not Greenland, the Panama Canal. If not that, then Canada. And what's next? So this is someone with whom he can do business, Putin, because that's a very familiar way of governing. You don't want parties. You don't want institutions. In fact, did you know that Putin is not a member technically of United Russia?
Oh, geez.
That's in the Russian constitution, that the president is not to be a member of a political party. So you can predict, a possible trajectory.
Oh, God.
Well, I was hoping that we would get it cheerier as we went along.
Great book.
But at any rate,
Thanks.
so
Party.
let's thank Didi for a great